My name is Keisha Brooks. I'm 38 years old, and for most of my adult life, people have described me with the same handful of words: calm, reliable, easygoing, the kind of woman who doesn't raise her voice in arguments, the kind who remembers birthdays without reminders, the kind who keeps quiet when everyone else is talking over each other. If you ask the people who know me casually, neighbors, coworkers, even some extended family, they would probably say I'm nice, the dependable one, the one who makes things smoother for everyone else. And for a long time, I was comfortable being seen that way. I work as a project coordinator for a small healthcare nonprofit in Chicago. My days are usually filled with spreadsheets, schedules, and the quiet satisfaction of keeping complicated things running smoothly. It's not glamorous work, but it suits me. I've always believed that stability matters more than attention. My husband, Daniel, used to say that was one of the things he loved most about me. "Keisha," he'd say, half joking when life felt tight financially, "you're the calm in my chaos." For nearly 8 years of our marriage, I believed that chaos was mostly financial. Daniel worked in sales, and according to him, income in that field could swing wildly. Some months were decent. Others were tight enough that we had to postpone plans or make small sacrifices. We weren't poor, but we were always careful. Careful about vacations, careful about renovations, careful about talking too much about money with other couples. And I believed that carefulness was just part of being responsible adults. So I adjusted. When friends upgraded their homes, I reminded myself we were being practical. When Daniel said commissions were slow that quarter, I tightened our budget without complaint. When we postponed our 10th anniversary trip for the 3rd time, I told myself patience was part of love. From the outside, our life looked ordinary, maybe even peaceful. But one quiet afternoon, one of those slow, unremarkable Saturdays where the sunlight settles gently through the living room windows, I opened a folder I hadn't meant to open. Inside it was a document that didn't match the life I thought we had been living. At first, I thought I misunderstood it. Then I thought it had to be a mistake. But the more I looked, the more one unsettling truth began to form piece by piece. My husband had not been struggling financially. Not last year. Not 5 years ago. Not even 8 years ago. For almost a decade. Daniel had been lying about his salary, and strangely, the discovery didn't lead to shouting or tears the way you might expect. Instead, it created something quieter. A long chain of questions. Questions about trust, about partnership, about the invisible roles people slowly assign each other in a marriage. And most of all, about what happens when you realize the story you believed about your life was never entirely true. This isn't a story about revenge. It's a story about clarity. About the moment when silence stops being submission and becomes something much more intentional. So before we begin, I want to ask you something simple. Have you ever discovered something about someone you trusted that made you quietly rethink your entire relationship with them? For most of our marriage, people thought they understood the dynamic between Daniel and me. Not because we ever explained it out loud, but because relationships have a way of silently assigning roles. And once those roles settle into place, everyone starts behaving as if they've always been true. Daniel was the charismatic one. He worked in sales for a logistics company. And if you had met him at a dinner party, you would have noticed him immediately. He had that kind of energy. Easy laughter, quick jokes, stories that seemed to stretch a little longer than necessary but were entertaining enough that no one minded. People leaned toward him when he spoke. They nodded when he explained things. And when the topic turned to money, which it often does among couples in their 30s, Daniel had a practiced humility about it. Sales were unpredictable, he'd say with a small shrug. Some months were good, others weren't. It was the kind of answer that made people feel sympathetic without asking too many questions. And beside him, usually sitting quietly with my hands wrapped around a glass of water or wine, was I, Keisha, the calm one, the supportive wife, The woman who smiled when Daniel joked about our budget lifestyle, and nodded when he mentioned that commissions had been slow that quarter. No one ever asked me for details, not because they were rude, but because the story already made sense in their minds. Daniel was the one out there trying to build something, and I was the one keeping things stable at home. Even our families seemed to accept this version of us. Daniel's mother, Patricia, had a habit of praising his work ethic whenever we visited. "Sales is a hard field," she'd say while placing dishes on the table. "You have to be tough to survive in it." Daniel would smile modestly, like he was slightly embarrassed by the compliment. Then Patricia's eyes would drift toward me. "And Keisha," she'd add, "you're good for him. You keep things steady." It wasn't meant as an insult, but there was always a subtle message underneath those words. Steady, reliable, supportive. The person who made sure the lights stayed on while someone else chased success. At work, the perception wasn't very different. My coworkers respected me, but in a quiet way. I was the person who fixed scheduling problems before anyone else noticed them. The one who remembered grant deadlines and caught errors in financial reports before they were submitted. But when leadership positions opened, people didn't immediately think of me, not because I wasn't capable, but because I didn't push myself forward. And if I'm being honest, part of me had grown comfortable with that invisibility. When you're the calm one, people rarely expect dramatic changes from you. They assume your life is predictable, simple. But what they didn't see, what almost no one noticed, was that my calmness wasn't the same thing as passivity. I paid attention to details. Always had. Maybe it was something about the way my mind worked. I noticed patterns the way some people notice music in the background. Bills that arrived earlier than expected. Numbers that didn't quite match last month's totals. Conversations where someone repeated the same explanation too many times. Small things. The kind of things that don't immediately cause suspicion, but quietly settle somewhere in the back of your mind. For years, those small things floated around my awareness like loose threads. Daniel mentioned a commission that fell through, a tax refund that seemed smaller than expected, an occasional purchase he explained away with a vague comment about company reimbursements. None of it felt big enough to question directly. And so I did what many people in long relationships do. I trusted the larger story. The story of my husband was doing his best in a difficult industry. The story where financial struggle was temporary. The story where patience was simply part of being a good partner. And from the outside, that story made sense to everyone, including me. At least, until one quiet afternoon when I opened a folder I wasn't supposed to see. And suddenly, every small thread I had ignored for years began pulling itself into something much harder to ignore. Something that made me realize the role people believed I played in my marriage was very different from the role I was about to step into. Looking back now, I don't think the first moment of disrespect was dramatic enough for anyone else to notice. That's the thing about small cuts. They don't arrive loudly. They don't interrupt conversations or make people uncomfortable. They slip quietly into ordinary moments. For me, it happened about 3 years into our marriage, during a dinner with 2 other couples we knew from Daniel's work. We had gone to a small Italian restaurant downtown, the kind with warm yellow lighting and tables close enough that everyone's conversations blended together in a soft background hum. Daniel was in one of his talkative moods that night. He was telling a story about a difficult client, someone who kept changing their mind about a contract. Everyone was laughing as he exaggerated the details, describing how exhausting sales could be. "It's like chasing smoke," he said, shaking his head. "You work for weeks, and sometimes the deal just disappears." One of the other men at the table, Mark, nodded sympathetically. "Yeah, commissions can be brutal," he said. "How do you guys manage with that kind of unpredictability?" For a moment, Daniel didn't answer. Instead, he glanced at me with a small smile, the kind that usually meant he was about to make a joke. "Well," he said lightly, resting his arm across the back of my chair. Keisha keeps us grounded. Everyone turned to look at me. I smiled politely. Daniel continued. She's the responsible one. If it were up to me, we'd probably be living on takeout and impulse purchases. The table laughed. It wasn't offensive. Not really. Couples tease each other like that all the time. But then he added something that made the laughter linger just a second longer. Honestly, he said, she's the reason we survive the slow months. I just bring in whatever I can. The words floated across the table so casually that no one questioned them. Mark nodded again. That's teamwork, he said. One of the women smiled at me. You must be really good with budgeting. I nodded slightly. I try, I said. And the conversation moved on. No tension, no awkwardness, just another harmless moment in a long dinner. But something about it stayed with me. Not the joke itself. It was the way Daniel had framed our life. The way he had spoken about his income was like it was unpredictable and fragile, like we were constantly adjusting around it. Because that description had become the foundation of many of our decisions. Why we delayed buying a larger home. Why we postponed certain trips. Why I sometimes covered unexpected expenses from my own savings. At the time, I told myself there was nothing strange about the conversation. Daniel wasn't insulting me. If anything, he was praising my practicality. But later that night, while we were washing dishes together, the memory of the dinner drifted back into my mind. I asked a simple question. Are things really that inconsistent at work right now? Daniel didn't hesitate. Yeah, he said, drying a plate. It's just how sales go. His tone was calm, confident, and because I trusted him, I accepted the answer. Still, something about that dinner had created a small shift in the way I listened to things afterward. Not suspicion, just awareness. The kind that makes you quietly notice patterns you used to ignore. And once your mind begins paying attention like that, you start seeing the same story repeated in more places than you expected. After that dinner, nothing in our lives changed immediately. Daniel still came home around the same time most evenings, sometimes tired, sometimes energized, depending on how his day had gone. We still shared quiet dinners in our small kitchen, still watched the same shows on the couch before bed. From the outside, our marriage looked steady, and in many ways it was. But once your awareness shifts, even slightly, you start hearing familiar conversations differently. Not louder, just clearer. Over the next couple of years, Daniel repeated the same story about our finances often enough that it began to feel like a script. At family gatherings, with friends, even with new neighbors. Whenever money came up, and somehow it always does when adults compare notes about life, Daniel would lean back in his chair and give a version of the same explanation. Sales are unpredictable. Sometimes he'd add a laugh. Keisha's the real financial planner in this house. Everyone would smile. And again, it sounded harmless. But what I began to notice wasn't just the words. It was the pattern. Daniel would describe our finances as fragile, uncertain, and always dependent on the next commission. Then he would shift the focus to me as the careful one, the quiet manager of our limited resources, the one who kept things from falling apart. And the strange thing was, people seemed to admire that story. Friends would nod approvingly. That's a good partnership, someone would say. You balance each other out. But each time it happened, a small part of me felt something I couldn't fully name at the time. It wasn't anger. It wasn't embarrassment. It was something closer to quiet discomfort. Because when Daniel described our life that way, he wasn't exactly lying. I did manage our budget carefully. I did make sure we saved whenever possible. I did think ahead about things like retirement and emergency funds. But the way he framed it made it sound as if our financial stability existed only because I was constantly compensating for his unstable income, as if we were barely holding things together. And gradually, that version of our life started shaping the decisions we made. When I mentioned the possibility of buying a larger house one day, Daniel would sigh gently. Maybe when commissions stabilize. Amo si sama mania mamos. When I suggested we finally take the anniversary trip we had talked about for years, he would shake his head with a small smile. Let's wait until the next good quarter. At first, I agreed easily. It sounded responsible, practical. But over time, something subtle happened inside me. I stopped bringing certain ideas up at all. Not because Daniel ever told me not to, but because I had absorbed the role our story had assigned me. The careful one, the patient is one. The one who understood that sometimes dreams had to be postponed. Looking back now, I realize that was the real power of the narrative Daniel repeated so often. It didn't just explain our situation to other people. It quietly shaped the way I behaved, the way I planned, the way I accepted limitations that might not have needed to exist. And the longer that pattern continued, the more natural it seemed, like a groove worn slowly into the floor of our life. Until one afternoon, years later, when I opened a folder in our home office and saw a number that didn't belong in that story at all. A number so different from what I had believed. For a moment, I thought I must be misunderstanding it. But once I looked closer, the story that had defined our marriage for 8 years began to unravel with a single, quiet question. If Daniel's income had really been unstable all this time, then why did this document say something very different? It's strange how roles in relationships don't always arrive through direct conversations. No one ever sits down and says, "This will be your position from now on." Instead, roles grow quietly out of repetition. A comment here, a decision there. A story told often enough that it begins to feel like the truth. Somewhere along the way, the role I had in our marriage became very clear, not just to Daniel, but to everyone around us. I was the dependable one, the stabilizer, the person who made sure life stayed manageable while Daniel dealt with the unpredictable world of sales. At first, that role didn't bother me. In fact, it matched parts of my personality. I had always been organized. I liked knowing where things stood. I liked planning ahead, keeping our finances balanced, and making sure we had savings for emergencies. But over time, I started to notice how that role shaped the way people spoke to me. When Daniel's friends talked about investments or big career moves, they directed most of the conversation toward him. When couples compared salaries or promotions, Daniel usually answered first. And when financial caution came up, saving, budgeting, delaying things, it somehow always circled back to me. Keisha probably keeps everything in line, someone would say. Or Daniel would laugh lightly and add something like, "She's the practical one. I just try to keep up." Again, it sounded harmless, even flattering in a way. But there was something else embedded inside that pattern. If Daniel was the one navigating uncertainty, then I was the one expected to quietly absorb its consequences. For example, when we postponed our anniversary trip for the 3rd year in a row, Daniel explained it the same way he always did. "Next year will be better," he said. And I nodded, because in our story, patience was my responsibility. Another time, we attended a housewarming party for a couple who had just bought a beautiful new home in the suburbs. Large windows, a backyard big enough for summer gatherings, the kind of place that makes you imagine the next chapter of your life unfolding there. On the drive home, I mentioned that maybe we could start looking at homes like that in the next year or two. Daniel sighed softly. "Let's wait until things stabilize a bit." Pasaito. Then he added something that sounded almost like reassurance. "You're better at thinking long-term than I am anyway." So once again, the decision quietly folded into the role I had been given. The careful one. The patient is one. The one who understood why certain opportunities had to be postponed. And the strange thing was, no one ever questioned this arrangement. Not our friends, not our families, not even me. Because from the outside, it looked like a healthy balance. One person chasing income, one person maintaining stability. But what I didn't realize at the time was how much power that narrative gave Daniel. If our finances were always uncertain, then nearly every delay, every compromise, every cautious decision could be explained by that uncertainty. And because I trusted him, I never asked for proof. I never asked to see detailed numbers. I never wondered whether the situation might be different from what he described. Until the afternoon when I sat down in our home office to organize a stack of old documents and accidentally opened a folder that had nothing to do with the task I had started. Inside it was a financial statement. At first glance, it looked ordinary, just another piece of paperwork among many. But then I noticed one number. A number that didn't match the role I had been living inside for 8 years. A number that quietly asked a question I couldn't ignore anymore. What if the story I believed about our finances was never true in the first place? The moment everything changed didn't feel dramatic at first. There was no argument, no raised voices, no sudden confrontation, just a quiet Saturday afternoon. Daniel had left earlier that morning to meet a client for lunch. The apartment was unusually still, the kind of calm that makes ordinary chores feel almost peaceful. I had decided to organize our home office, not because anything was wrong, just because paperwork had begun piling up in small stacks on the desk. Insurance statements, old utility bills, a few unopened envelopes that probably contained nothing urgent. It was the kind of task I often handled, part of the role I had settled into. I remember the sunlight coming through the window beside the desk, landing in soft rectangles across the carpet. Dust particles drifted slowly through the air every time I moved a folder. For the first hour, everything was exactly what I expected. Receipts, old tax documents, bank statements from accounts we both knew about. Then I reached a thin gray folder tucked behind a row of binders. It didn't look particularly important, just another piece of paperwork waiting to be sorted. I opened it absent-mindedly. Inside were several documents printed on thick white paper. At the top of the first page was the name of Daniel's company. Underneath it was something that made me pause. A compensation summary. At first, I assumed it was old, maybe something from years ago, before commissions had started fluctuating. But as my eyes moved down the page, I noticed the date. Last year. And beneath that date was a number. A salary figure so different from what I believed that my brain didn't process it immediately. I blinked once, then again. The number stayed the same. It wasn't just slightly higher than I expected. It was more than double the income Daniel had told me he was making. For a moment, my first instinct was to explain it away. Maybe this included bonuses that never actually paid out. Maybe it was a projected income estimate. Maybe I was misreading something. I flipped to the next page, then the next. Each document told the same quiet story. Base salary, quarterly commissions, annual earnings. The pattern was clear enough that it left very little room for misunderstanding. Daniel's income hadn't been unstable. It had been consistently strong. Not just last year. For years. I sat back slowly in the chair, the papers still in my hands. And what surprised me most in that moment wasn't anger. It was silent. A deep, thoughtful stillness settles inside my mind. Because when something you believed for nearly a decade suddenly collapses, your thoughts don't immediately jump to conclusions. Instead, they begin rearranging memories. Small moments from the past started drifting through my mind. Conversations about delaying trips, discussions about tight budgets, the careful way I had carefully adjusted our spending to match the story Daniel had told me. Every one of those memories now looked slightly different, like photographs where the lighting had changed. I didn't rush to call him. I didn't send a message asking for an explanation. Instead, I placed the documents back on the desk and stared at them for a long time. Not because I didn't understand what they meant, but because I was beginning to understand something else. If Daniel had been telling the truth about our finances all along, then the role I had accepted in our marriage made sense. But if he had been lying for 8 years, then the story I had been living inside wasn't just incomplete. It had been carefully constructed. And the quiet realization that followed was the moment everything inside me shifted. Not loudly, not emotionally, just a calm, deliberate thought forming at the center of my mind. If this number is real, then there are probably other things I haven't seen yet. The rest of that afternoon passed quietly. I finished organizing the office the same way I had planned to when I first sat down at the desk. Papers were sorted into folders. Old envelopes went into the recycling bin. The gray folder with Daniel's compensation documents was placed back exactly where I had found it. From the outside, nothing about the room looked different. But inside my mind, something had changed in a way I couldn't undo. For 8 years, I had trusted the story Daniel told me about our finances. And because I trusted him, I had built my decisions around that story. Now, sitting alone in the quiet apartment, I understood something that took a moment to fully settle in. If he had been lying, it wasn't a mistake. It wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a decision repeated over and over again, year after year. And strangely, that realization didn't push me toward confrontation. It pushed me toward stillness. When Daniel came home that evening, I greeted him the same way I always did. He set his keys on the kitchen counter and kissed my cheek. "Lunch went well," he said. "The client might sign next week." I nodded while stirring a pot of pasta sauce on the stove. "That's good," I said. My voice sounded normal, even to me. Daniel didn't notice anything unusual. Why would he? For years, I had been the calm one. The patient is one. The person who didn't react dramatically to stressful situations. That role now worked in my favor. At dinner, we talked about ordinary things. A coworker at my nonprofit was leaving for another job. A new show Daniel had heard about from a colleague. The weather forecast for the upcoming week. Small, harmless conversations. But underneath those words, something inside me had become very quiet and focused. I watched Daniel the way someone watches a familiar movie after learning the ending. The same expressions, the same tone of voice, the same easy explanations about work. Except now, every detail carried a new question. Not suspicion, observation. That night, after Daniel fell asleep beside me, I lay awake for a while staring at the ceiling. For the first time since discovering those documents, I allowed myself to ask the question that had been forming all day. Why? Why would someone lie about something like that for so long? There were many possibilities. Maybe he was hiding debt. Maybe he had separate investments. Maybe there were financial obligations he hadn't told me about. But there was also another possibility. One that felt more uncomfortable the longer I thought about it. What if the lie wasn't about protecting me from stress, but about controlling the story of our life? If Daniel was the one bringing in unpredictable income, then he remained the central figure in our financial future, the one chasing opportunity, the one taking risks. And I remained exactly where the narrative had placed me. The stabilizer. The patient partner adjusted her expectations around his uncertainty. For years, I had accepted that role without questioning it. Now I realized something important. I didn't have to react immediately. I didn't have to accuse him without understanding the full picture. Silence, for the first time, wasn't something I was falling into. It was something I was choosing. Because if the documents I had found were only part of the truth, then reacting too quickly might close doors that patience could open. So, instead of confronting Daniel the next morning, I made a quiet decision. For the first time in our marriage, I would start paying attention to the details he assumed I wasn't watching. And the strange thing was, Daniel never noticed that anything had changed. If there's one thing people misunderstand about quiet personalities, it's this. They assume silence means inaction. That if someone isn't reacting loudly, they must not be doing anything at all. Daniel had believed that about me for years. So did most people in our lives. The calm one. The patient is one. The person who handled routine responsibilities while everyone else focused on bigger things. What none of them realized was that my quietness had always come with something else. Observation. And once I made the decision not to confront Daniel right away, that observation slowly turned into preparation. Not dramatic preparation. Nothing that would raise suspicion. Just small adjustments in the way I moved through my own life. The first thing I did was something very simple. I started paying closer attention to our finances. Not just the monthly expenses I already managed, but the broader structure of our accounts. For years, Daniel and I had maintained a comfortable arrangement. We had a joint checking account for shared bills, and we both had personal accounts where our individual salaries were deposited. It had always seemed reasonable, independent even. But now I realized that arrangement also meant there were parts of our financial life I had never examined closely. So I began reviewing documents more carefully. Bank statements, tax returns, investment summaries that Daniel occasionally left on his desk before filing them away. I didn't go searching aggressively. I simply stopped overlooking details that I might have ignored before. And the more I looked, the more the pattern became clear. Daniel's income had been consistently high for years. Not just stable, impressive. The compensation summaries I had found in that gray folder weren't exceptions. They were confirmations. Quarterly commission reports, year-end bonus statements, employer retirement contributions that reflected a salary far higher than what he had described to me. Each document quietly reinforced the same truth. Daniel hadn't been exaggerating about financial struggles. He had been inventing them. And yet, even as that realization grew stronger, I didn't feel the urge to confront him immediately. Instead, another question began shaping my thinking. If he had hidden this much, what else might exist outside the story I knew? So my preparation expanded slightly. At work, during my lunch breaks, I started reviewing basic financial information that most married couples take for granted, but rarely examine carefully. Property records, public tax databases, simple searches that confirmed ownership histories and asset disclosures. Nothing invasive, just information that already existed in public records. I also scheduled something I had been meaning to do for years but had never prioritized. A meeting with a financial advisor. Not because I planned to make any dramatic decisions, but because understanding the full landscape of my own finances suddenly felt important. During that meeting, I asked practical questions. How assets are typically structured in long marriages. How retirement accounts function when both spouses have separate income streams. What documentation is necessary to understand the full financial picture of a household. The advisor didn't know anything about my suspicions. To him, I was simply a careful client asking thoughtful questions. But every answer he gave helped me see my situation with increasing clarity. And through all of this, Daniel never noticed a thing. Our routines stayed the same. We still shared dinner most evenings. We still visited his parents once a month. We still had the same casual conversations about work and daily life. If anything, my behavior seemed even calmer than before, which only made it easier for me to continue learning quietly. The most surprising part of those weeks wasn't what I discovered. It was how much patience changed the way I understood the situation. Because the more information I gathered, the clearer one truth became. Daniel's lie about his salary wasn't covering up a financial disaster. It wasn't protecting us from debt. If anything, it had hidden the opposite. Our financial position had been far stronger than I ever realized, which meant the real question was no longer about money. It was about intention. Why had my husband allowed me to believe we were struggling when the evidence suggested we were anything but? By the time that question settled fully in my mind, I had already gathered enough information to understand something else. Something Daniel probably never imagined I would discover. Not loudly, not dramatically, just a quiet piece of leverage that changed the way I saw the future of our marriage. And the moment I confirmed it, I realized the next decision I made would be impossible to undo. The discovery that changed everything didn't happen in our apartment. It happened on a quiet Tuesday afternoon in a small financial office downtown. By that point, several weeks had passed since the day I found Daniel's compensation documents. In that time, I had gathered enough information to understand the basics of our financial situation. But there was still one piece missing: a complete picture. The financial advisor I had scheduled the appointment with, Mr. Reynolds, sat across from me at a tidy desk with a computer monitor angled slightly toward the client chair. He had the calm, patient demeanor of someone who spent his career explaining complicated systems in simple terms. "So," he said gently, folding his hands together, "what would you like to review today?" I had prepared carefully for this conversation. Not emotionally, practically. "I'd like to understand our household finances better," I said. "Retirement accounts, tax filings, things like that." He nodded. "Do you and your husband file jointly?" "Yes." "Then we can start there." Over the next 40 minutes, we reviewed documents I had brought with me. Tax returns from the last several years, along with a few investment statements Daniel had left accessible at home. Mr. Reynolds typed occasionally, reviewing numbers and asking routine questions. Nothing about the meeting felt dramatic, until he paused. He leaned slightly closer to the screen, his eyebrows tightening just a little. "Your husband works for Northbridge Logistics, correct?" "Yes." "And his compensation includes commissions?" "That's what he's told me." "Mr." Reynolds clicked through a few more pages. Then he turned the monitor slightly so I could see the summary he had opened. "This may not be new information to you," he said calmly, "but based on these filings, your household income has been quite substantial for several years." I studied the screen. The numbers were organized neatly into columns: salary, commissions, bonuses, and employer retirement contributions. But what caught my attention wasn't just the total, it was the pattern. Year after year. Consistent. Strong. Far beyond the modest income Daniel had described during casual conversations with friends and family. Mr. Reynolds continued speaking in the same neutral tone. "From a financial planning perspective, you and your husband are in a very stable position." I nodded slowly. "I see." He hesitated slightly before asking his next question. "Have you both discussed long-term investment strategies together?" That question settled quietly between us. I could feel the weight of it, because the honest answer was simple. No, we hadn't. Not in any meaningful way. For 8 years, our financial conversations had been shaped by the assumption that money was unpredictable and occasionally scarce. But according to the documents in front of me, that assumption had never been true. I thanked Mr. Reynolds for his time and scheduled a follow-up meeting before leaving the office. When I stepped back out onto the street, the city noise felt strangely distant. Cars passed. People hurried along the sidewalks. Everything looked exactly the same as it had that morning. But inside my mind, something had shifted again. This time, the realization was clearer than before. Daniel's lie hadn't been small. It hadn't been temporary. It had shaped the entire framework of our marriage. Our postponed trips, our cautious budgeting, even the way he described our life to other people. All of it had been built around a version of reality that wasn't true. And yet, the most surprising emotion I felt in that moment wasn't anger. It was clarity. Because now I understand something important. Information is power. Not the loud, dramatic kind people imagine in movies. The quiet kind. The kind that comes from understanding your position completely before making a decision. By the time I reached home that evening, I knew 2 things for certain. First, Daniel had been hiding the truth about his income for almost a decade. And second, there were legal and financial implications to that kind of deception that most people never consider until they have to, which meant the next step wasn't confrontation. Not yet. The next step was deciding what I was going to do with the truth I now carried. For a few days after the meeting with Mr. Reynolds, I didn't make any decisions. I went to work as usual. I attended meetings, answered emails, helped a colleague organize a grant proposal that had a deadline approaching at the end of the month. From the outside, my life continued moving along the same steady path it always had. But internally, I was standing at a quiet crossroads. Because once you understand the truth about something this significant, you realize there are several directions you could go, and each one changes the future in a different way. The first option was the most obvious. I could confront Daniel immediately. I could place the documents on the table one evening after dinner and ask a simple question. Why have you been lying to me about your salary for 8 years? That conversation would probably be emotional, possibly defensive, maybe even explosive, but it would at least bring the truth into the open quickly. The second option was quieter. I could ignore what I had discovered, pretend the documents didn't matter, continue living the same life we had always lived. Some people do that. They decide the stability of their relationship matters more than uncomfortable truths. For a day or two, I considered that possibility, but the longer I thought about it, the more I realized something important. The problem wasn't just the lie itself, it was the years of decisions that had been built on that lie. Trips postponed, opportunities delayed. Conversations were shaped around a financial reality that never actually existed. Ignoring that kind of history wouldn't restore trust. It would simply bury the discomfort deeper. Then there was the third option, the one that required the most patience. Instead of reacting emotionally, I could respond strategically, not in a vindictive way, just carefully, by making sure I understood every aspect of our situation before deciding what kind of future I wanted. That option required time and quiet preparation. But the more I thought about it, the more it felt aligned with who I had always been. I had never been someone who made life-altering decisions in the heat of a single moment. I preferred clarity, and clarity requires information. So over the next week, I began asking myself a different set of questions. What did I actually want from my life moving forward? Was this marriage still built on enough honesty to rebuild trust? And if it wasn't, what would independence look like for me? Those questions didn't have easy answers, but something else became clear while I was thinking about them. For years, Daniel had assumed I would always remain inside the role our story had given me. The patient partner, the quiet stabilizer, the person who adjusted to circumstances rather than reshaping them. And in many ways, that assumption had been true. Until now. Because discovering the truth about our finances had changed something fundamental. Not just about Daniel. About me. For the first time in our marriage, I realized I had more options than I had allowed myself to imagine. And once that realization settles into your mind, it's difficult to return to the smaller version of your life. So by the end of that week, I made a decision. Not about Daniel yet, but about myself. Before any confrontation happened, before any difficult conversations began, I would quietly ensure that I understood every legal and financial aspect of our life together. Because whatever direction the future took, I wanted to walk into it fully prepared. Once the decision was made, everything I did after that felt calm and deliberate. Not secretive in a dramatic sense, just careful. Preparation has a quiet rhythm to it. It doesn't rush. It doesn't demand attention. It simply unfolds step by step until one day you realize the landscape around you has changed. The first step was information. I scheduled another meeting with Mr. Reynolds, this time with a slightly different focus. Instead of asking broad questions about investments, I asked about financial transparency within marriages. What happens, I asked casually, if one partner doesn't fully understand the household finances? Mr. Reynolds didn't seem surprised by the question. It's more common than people realize, he said. Many couples divide responsibilities. One person handles the details, the other trusts them. He paused before adding something else. But ideally, both partners should understand the full picture, especially when long-term assets are involved. I understand that, auntie. That phrase stayed with me. Long-term assets. During that meeting, I learned about several things Daniel and I technically shared: retirement contributions, tax structures, and the legal implications of assets accumulated during a marriage. Again, nothing dramatic, just facts. The second step was something I had quietly postponed for years. I reviewed my own career plans. For a long time, I had worked comfortably in my role at the nonprofit. The work was meaningful, and the environment was stable. But stability had also kept me from exploring certain opportunities. Now, with a different awareness of our financial reality and my own independence, I began updating my resume and reconnecting with professional contacts I hadn't spoken to in a while. Not because I planned to leave immediately, but because preparation meant having choices. Meanwhile, at home, life continued exactly as it always had. Daniel still talked about unpredictable commissions, still mentioned slow quarters whenever expensive plans came up, still joked with friends about how careful I was with our budget. And every time he repeated those lines, I listened with a new kind of calm. Not anger, just clarity. Because once you understand the structure of a lie, it loses the power it once had. One evening, while we were eating dinner, Daniel casually mentioned that a colleague had just bought a vacation property. "Must be nice," he said with a laugh. "Maybe someday if sales go crazy." I nodded. Maybe. The conversation moved on. He never noticed that I didn't ask follow-up questions the way I used to. Over the next month, several quiet changes took place in my life. I opened a separate savings account under my own name. I organized my personal financial documents. I continued meeting with Mr. Reynolds, learning more about long-term financial planning and legal protections. None of these actions was dramatic. None of them disrupted our daily routines. But together, they slowly shifted something fundamental. For years, Daniel had believed the story of our marriage placed him at the center of our financial future. The risk taker. The provider is navigating uncertainty. What he never realized was that by hiding the truth, he had unintentionally given me the most valuable thing possible. Time. Time to understand the full picture. Time to prepare for any outcome. And time to decide what kind of life I truly wanted next. Because preparation has an interesting side effect. The more ready you become, the less afraid you feel. And by the end of that month, I noticed something surprising about myself. The quiet anxiety that had once accompanied our financial conversations was gone. In its place was something else. A steady sense of control. Not over Daniel, but over my own future. Preparation does something interesting to your perspective. Once you stop reacting emotionally, you begin noticing patterns that were always there, but previously hidden behind assumptions. For years, I had accepted Daniel's explanations about money without questioning them too deeply. Not because I was naive, but because trust often fills the gaps where curiosity might otherwise live. Now, those gaps were gone, and the patterns were suddenly very clear. The first moment that truly confirmed it came on an ordinary Tuesday evening. Daniel walked into the kitchen, looking slightly irritated, tossing his car keys onto the counter. "Long day?" I asked, rinsing vegetables in the sink. "You could say that," he replied. "Client canceled last minute. The whole deal fell apart." In the past, I would have responded with sympathy. Maybe asked what happened, maybe reassured him that the next opportunity would come along. This time, I simply nodded. That's frustrating. But internally, something else was happening. Because earlier that same afternoon, while organizing some documents Mr. Reynolds had given me, I had come across a report listing Daniel's quarterly commission distributions. The date on the most recent payment? 3 days ago. A large one. Large enough that his slow quarter explanation from the previous week suddenly sounded very different. I didn't confront him, not because I was afraid of the truth, but because I had already seen it. And when you already understand the reality of a situation, confrontation often becomes unnecessary. Instead, I watched. The next few weeks became an exercise in observation. Daniel's habits, once background noise in our marriage, now stood out with surprising clarity. The new watch he started wearing, something sleek and expensive that he described as a client gift. The extra golf outings that somehow appeared during the weeks he described as financially stressful. The casual way he sometimes dismissed my budgeting suggestions with a joking remark about my non-profit mindset. None of it caused arguments anymore, because I no longer needed validation. I simply took note. Meanwhile, my own life continued evolving quietly. A former colleague from my nonprofit connected me with a consulting opportunity, temporary at first, but significantly better compensated than my current position. I accepted. The work was challenging and intellectually engaging, but more importantly, it represented something I hadn't fully experienced in years. Independence. Not emotional independence. Financial independence. The kind that quietly changes the balance of power in ways people rarely notice at first. One evening, about 6 weeks after my initial meeting with Mr. Reynolds, Daniel and I attended a dinner party hosted by one of his coworkers. It was the kind of event we had been to many times before. Wine, polite conversation, stories about work and travel. At one point, the conversation turned to investment strategies. Daniel laughed lightly and said something familiar. "Oh, Emily handles most of our budgeting. I'm the risky one with income that goes up and down." The group chuckled. In the past, I would have smiled politely and let the comment pass. This time, I smiled too. But my response was slightly different. "I used to think that," I said calmly. "But recently I've been learning a lot more about our financial structure." Daniel glanced at me quickly. Just a brief look. Not an alarm. Not yet. Just curiosity. "What brought that on?" one of the guests asked. I shrugged lightly. Preparation. It's amazing how much clarity you get when you start looking closely at numbers. The conversation moved on almost immediately, but Daniel's behavior changed subtly for the rest of the evening. He was quieter, more attentive, and when we got into the car to drive home, he asked a question he hadn't asked in years. "What kind of financial stuff have you been looking into lately?" I turned slightly in my seat. "Oh, just general planning," I said calmly. "Retirement structures, asset allocation, long-term protections." The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable, but it was different. Because for the first time in our marriage, Daniel was realizing something he had never needed to consider before. I was no longer simply trusting the story he had been telling. I was verifying it. And verification changes everything. The first real sign of Daniel's unease appeared in small ways. Not accusations, not confrontations. Just subtle shifts in behavior. For years, Daniel had moved through our lives with a kind of effortless confidence. He assumed he understood the structure of our marriage, the roles we both played within it, and the boundaries neither of us would cross. But once someone begins asking different questions, even quietly, the structure of those assumptions begins to loosen. It started with his curiosity about our accounts. One evening while we were sitting in the living room, he looked up from his laptop and asked casually, "Have you been going through our financial files lately?" His tone was neutral, but I recognized the carefulness behind it. "Yes," I replied simply. "Just organizing things." He nodded slowly. "That's good." The conversation ended there, but over the next several weeks, Daniel's calm confidence became something else. Restlessness. He began asking more questions about my consulting work. How long is that contract supposed to last? Do they plan to extend it? Is it taking up a lot of your time? None of these questions was unreasonable on its own, but the frequency of them was new, and underneath them I sensed something deeper: uncertainty. For years, Daniel had quietly controlled the narrative around our finances. Now that narrative was slipping beyond his reach. The moment when that realization truly landed for him came unexpectedly. I was in the kitchen one afternoon reviewing some paperwork when he walked in holding a piece of mail. His expression was tight. "Emily," he said slowly, "why did we get a statement from a financial planning firm addressed to both of us?" I looked up from the table. "Oh," I said calmly, "that's from a consultation I scheduled a few weeks ago." "A consultation?" he repeated. "Yes." "With who?" "An independent advisor." He stood there for a moment, absorbing the information. Why? It was the first time his voice carried something sharper than curiosity. Not anger. Concern. Real concern. I set my pen down and folded my hands on the table. "Because I realized I didn't fully understand our long-term financial structure," I said. "And I think it's important that I do." Daniel stared at me for a moment. "You could have just asked me." I nodded. "That's true." Silence filled the kitchen. Then he asked the question that revealed everything. "What exactly did you show them?" The phrasing was interesting. Not "what did you ask them?" "What did you show them?" Which meant he already understood the risk. "Everything that's part of our joint finances," I answered. His shoulders stiffened slightly. For the first time in years, Daniel looked like someone who had lost track of the story he had been telling. He pulled out a chair across from me and sat down slowly. "What made you start looking into all this?" he asked. The question hung in the air between us. There were many possible answers, but I chose the simplest one. "Clarity," I said. He studied my face carefully, as if trying to determine how much I knew, how far the truth had already traveled, and perhaps whether there was still time to pull it back. But the thing about long-standing lies is this: once someone begins tracing their edges, the structure begins to collapse on its own. You don't have to push it. You only have to keep looking. Daniel leaned back in his chair, suddenly quieter than I had seen him in years. For the first time since the day I discovered the documents, I saw genuine panic flicker behind his calm exterior. Not explosive panic, not shouting or denying. Just the quiet realization that something fundamental had changed, and that whatever control he once had over the narrative of our life was already gone. The conversation finally happened on a quiet Sunday evening. There was nothing dramatic about the setting. No raised voices, no sudden discoveries, just the soft sound of rain against the windows and the low hum of the dishwasher running in the kitchen. Daniel and I were sitting across from each other at the dining table. For several minutes, neither of us spoke. It wasn't an uncomfortable silence. It felt more like the pause that comes when two people understand that a certain moment has finally arrived. Daniel was the first to break it. "So," he said carefully, "I think we should talk about the financial advisor." I folded my hands calmly on the table. "I agree." He exhaled slowly, as if choosing each word before letting it leave his mouth. "You said you showed them our financial information." "Yes." "And what exactly did they say?" The question wasn't casual, it was cautious. I looked at him for a moment before answering. "They helped me understand the structure of our accounts," I said. "Our investments. Your commissions." Daniel's eyes moved slightly at that last word. "Commissions?" "Yes." Another pause. Then he leaned back in his chair and rubbed his hands together slowly. "What exactly do you think you found, Emily?" His tone was controlled, measured, but the tension beneath it was impossible to miss. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse him. I simply said the truth out loud. "For 8 years," I said calmly, "you've been telling me your income was unstable." Daniel didn't respond. "For 8 years," I continued, "I believed we were adjusting our lives around financial uncertainty." The rain outside the window grew slightly heavier. "And now?" he asked quietly. "Now I understand that the uncertainty wasn't real." He stared at the table for a long moment, not angry, not defensive, just thinking. Finally, he looked back up at me. "It's not that simple." I nodded slightly. "I'm sure it isn't." He ran a hand through his hair, searching for words. "You know how sales work," he said. "Some years are strong, some are weaker. I didn't want to create pressure or expectations." "That's understandable," I replied. His eyes narrowed slightly. "You don't sound angry." "I'm not." That seemed to unsettle him more than anger would have. "Then what are you feeling?" he asked. I thought about the question before answering. Clarity. The words sat quietly between us. Daniel studied my face, perhaps hoping to find something else. Resentment, frustration, emotional chaos. But there was none. Because the emotional storm had already passed weeks ago, when I first opened that folder in Mr. Reynolds' office. What remained now was simply understanding. "You could have asked me about this," Daniel said after a moment. "I did," I replied softly. He frowned slightly. "When?" "Every time we planned something, and you said we couldn't afford it." The realization landed slowly. I watched it cross his expression piece by piece. For years, Daniel had believed the narrative he created gave him control over our shared future. But control built on an incomplete truth is fragile. Eventually, someone notices the missing pieces. And once they do, the conversation becomes very simple. "I'm not interested in arguing about the past," I said gently. Daniel looked up again. "Then what are you interested in?" "The future." Another silence settled between us, but this one felt different, because Daniel was finally realizing something that had been quietly unfolding for months. This conversation wasn't the beginning of a conflict. It was the closing chapter of a long misunderstanding. And whatever came next would be built on the full truth. In the weeks after that conversation, our house became quieter. Not in a cold or hostile way, just reflective. Daniel and I still shared the same routines. We still made dinner together some evenings. We still passed each other in the hallway with small, familiar gestures, handing over a cup of coffee, asking about each other's day. But something fundamental had shifted between us. For the first time in our marriage, the invisible structure that had quietly shaped our roles was gone. There was no longer a story about unstable income guiding our decisions. No longer an assumption that Daniel carried the financial weight of uncertainty while I adjusted around it. What replaced that structure wasn't anger. It was space. And space has an interesting effect on people. It forces them to confront who they actually are when the roles they've been playing fall away. For Daniel, that process looked complicated. Some days he seemed thoughtful, even remorseful. Other days he appeared uncertain how to speak about what had happened at all. He apologized once, quietly, over breakfast. "I should have been more honest," he said. I appreciated that, but honesty, like trust, isn't something that returns the moment it's acknowledged. It takes time to rebuild, and sometimes it evolves into something entirely different. For me, the change felt clearer, because the biggest transformation wasn't about Daniel. It was about how I saw myself. For years, I had unconsciously accepted a smaller version of my own role in our life together. Not because Daniel demanded it, but because the story we lived inside made that role feel natural. The patient partner, the stabilizer, the one who quietly adapted when circumstances seemed uncertain. There is nothing inherently wrong with that kind of strength. But I had slowly realized something during the months of preparation, research, and quiet observation. Adaptability should never require invisibility, and patience should never mean silence in the face of confusion. The consulting work I had started continued to grow. What began as a temporary contract turned into a longer collaboration, and eventually, a leadership role on a new initiative the organization was launching. For the first time in many years, my professional life felt expansive again. Not because of money, but because of the possibility. I also continued meeting with financial advisors, not out of suspicion, but out of education. Understanding the systems that shape our futures felt empowering in a way I hadn't expected. Daniel noticed these changes, of course. One evening, he watched me working on my laptop at the dining table and said quietly, "You've changed a lot this year." I thought about that for a moment before answering. "Maybe," I said. "Or maybe I just started paying attention to things I used to overlook." He nodded slowly, and that was the truth of it. The discovery that afternoon in Mr. Reynolds' office had felt like a betrayal at first. But over time, I came to understand it as something else. A turning point. Not the end of my marriage. Not even necessarily the end of trust. But the end of a version of myself that believed quiet acceptance was the same thing as strength. Because real strength isn't about enduring confusion forever. Sometimes, it's about stepping back, observing carefully, and deciding that your future deserves full clarity. Looking back now, what surprises me most about that entire experience is how quietly it unfolded. There were no dramatic confrontations, no shouting matches, no moment where everything collapsed at once. Instead, the truth arrived the way many important realizations do, softly, almost accidentally, on an ordinary afternoon while I was sorting through paperwork. For a long time, I thought the most important part of this story was the lie itself. 8 years of believing something about our financial life that wasn't entirely true. 8 years of shaping decisions around an incomplete version of reality. But as time passed, I began to understand that the lie wasn't actually the center of the story. The center was awareness. Because once you become aware of something, once you see the full picture clearly, you are given a quiet but powerful choice. You can react immediately, driven by emotion and hurt. Or you can pause, observe, understand what the truth really means for your life. That pause changed everything for me. Instead of turning the discovery into a battle, I turned it into an education. I learned about our finances. I reconnected with my own professional ambitions. I built independence, not as an act of rebellion, but as an act of self-respect. And somewhere along the way, I realized something important about relationships. Trust isn't just about honesty. It's also about participation. Both people deserve to understand the life they're building together. Not just emotionally, but practically. When one person carries all the information, the relationship slowly becomes unbalanced, often without either person fully noticing. Today, Daniel and I are still navigating what honesty looks like in our marriage going forward. Some days are easy, some days require patience. But the difference now is that our conversations happen in the open, not inside assumptions. And for me, that clarity has changed the way I see myself more than anything else. I'm still patient, still thoughtful, still someone who prefers calm over chaos. But I'm no longer someone who leaves important questions unasked simply to keep the peace. Because peace built on silence isn't really peace at all. It's just quiet confusion. And sometimes the most powerful thing you can do for your future is choose clarity over comfort. So now I'm curious about something. If you discovered that someone close to you had been quietly hiding the truth about something important for years, would you confront them immediately? Or would you do what I did? Pause, learn everything you could, and move forward with quiet preparation. I'd really like to hear how you would handle it.
Cảm ơn bạn đã lắng nghe câu chuyện vừa rồi. Đừng quên like, share và bấm chuông để không bỏ lỡ câu chuyện mới nhất. Hẹn gặp lại.